Lately, I've focused my energy on making good KeyShot tutorials, but today, I just don't feel like it. So I'm gonna make a bad KeyShot tutorial, and I'm gonna show you how to make a sponge in KeyShot. All right, after grabbing the project file from the file vault on my website, you can import the step file that I've modeled for you into KeyShot. We'll take the default KeyShot settings. Couple things to mention, I rounded off all the edges here because we're gonna be using tools like Displacement and Fuzz. And when we do that, if you don't have filleted edges, the whole model comes unstitched and you have sharp seams and it just doesn't look good. The other thing I'm gonna mention considering is that I will be working in CPU mode. I don't recommend necessarily working in GPU mode here because this scene's gonna get pretty heavy with lots of displacement and fuzz as well. And unless you have a lot of VRAM in your GPU, you could run into some issues there. Finally, I'm gonna open the heads-up display with the H key. This gives us this little window here that gives us some relevant information about our scene. We're starting off with a small triangle count of 25,000, but this is going to balloon to over probably 5 or 10 million before we're done. So good to keep an eye on this because you'll see the relationship between performance and your materials and mesh, if that makes sense. We're gonna start on the bottom part of the sponge. So I'm gonna hide the top part with Control-Alt-Left-Click. And we're gonna use a reference image. I got this picture from the internet. It's pretty much what I'm going for. It's a dried out sponge. It's not the prettiest thing. So let's start by making this dried out looking sponge material. We'll double click on this guy. And we're pretty much gonna be spending our time in the material graph for the rest of today's tutorial. I don't need anything here on the left from my materials library. So I'm gonna go ahead and close that. And that way we can keep an eye on our sponge as well as our material graph. Now the first thing I want to do is go ahead and come up with the rough shape. So I'm going to right click, go to textures and spots. This is the main texture we're going to use to drive our displacement. We can pop it into the color of the diffuse for now until we shape it, and then we will use it with a geometry node called displace. So at this point I can double click on the spots node and dial it in. We're gonna be using this to get most of these indentations, and we want them to be relatively squished. Unfortunately, we can't do that 100%, but we can use some distortion in this to do that. So I'll start by increasing the density from 1 to 2, so we have a little bit more spots. I think I wanna keep the scale roughly where it's at, and then we'll increase the levels. When you add levels to any procedural texture, it adds another set of spots in this case. And it's also doing something by scaling them. So level scale means it can be either larger or in this case smaller by 1.9 times, I believe. So that's why we can get some really small spots among our really big ones. The intensity multiplier 2 will essentially control the, I think it usually controls the opacity. Yeah, so you see if I increase the intensity, it's also adjusting opacity for the next level. I'll leave that at 1. And we can increase this levels up to say 3 or 4. So we're getting a lot more spots, but I don't want as much difference between their scale. So I'm gonna bring the level scale down to 1.4. Now they're a lot closer to the same size. Using the levels is one way to get a lot more of them on our part. And then we could also use say 3 for the density value to drive that up a little bit further. We're gonna go ahead and play with distortion. So if I type 0.5, you'll see that now we get some kind of squished variation to our spots, and that's looking pretty good. And you can play with that. Finally, the seed, if you don't like this exact distribution, you can try another seed value. This number doesn't really correlate to anything. It's just another randomly generated version of this pattern, so you can play with it. You could also grab the move texture tool and move it up or down to try to get a different distribution. I think I'm gonna go a little bit higher with the distortion, so maybe 0.75. If you go too high, it starts to look a little bit stretchy or stretched, I guess. I also want a little bit more here, so let's try a density of 4. I think that's looking pretty good. Now what I wanna do is plug this into our displace. So I'm gonna right click, get a geometry displace node, pop it into the geometry socket on the root node, and we're gonna plug our spots into displace. We can take them off diffuse for now. Right now, if I double click on displace, it's got the default settings, which are way too big. I wanna displace this 1 millimeter for now, and I'll often start with a value even smaller than that, just to be safe. We're gonna go ahead and just hit execute and see how this goes. So you can see what happened. By using this texture, the black areas equal 0 and the white areas equal 1. If we look at the sponge from the side view and I plug this back in and hit refresh, the sponge is going to push outward. Watch this. So it got bigger. The reason it got bigger is because the white is equal to 1, the black is equal to 0. So the black values did not change, but the white did. So we could essentially do the opposite, because I don't necessarily want to make my sponge any bigger. I just want to poke holes into it. So how can we do that? If we look at our displace, the displacement height is a positive value, so it pushed out. We want it to push in. So we'll change it from 1 to -1. And if we go ahead and refresh that, you'll see it does the opposite of what we want it to do. It pushed the white area down, leaving the black area where it was. So that tells us we need to essentially invert the color here. We can use an invert node, but I prefer to actually change the colors within the node itself sometimes because it's a little bit cleaner and less confusing. So if I do this, in theory, this should give us what we want. And to prove it, if we disconnect this geometry node, refresh, and plug it back in, we should see when I generate or refresh the node, the outer extent of this sponge doesn't get any bigger, but we just poke holes into it. Boom, success. So yeah, they look like garbage, but we can fix that too. The reason they look so bad is because if we disable this material, we can see the mesh is not small enough. So we're not getting high enough resolution in our mesh. And we only have 222,000 triangles. If we go into that displace node, let's take our triangle size and start by making this smaller. I'll cut this in half and execute again, and these should look a little better now, and we've essentially doubled our triangle count. So that's to be expected. Let's bring this down to 0.1 and execute again. So right now, we've got about 4.4 million triangles. This is starting to look pretty good. We may not need to go much higher than this, but I still want to address this. In case you don't want this sort of harsh edges here, we can take this max triangles and increase it because this is setting a limiter on how many triangles can be added. So if I bring this from 6 to 12 or say 15, now I've got a pretty beefy computer. I'm not worried about what this will do, but just be, you know, if you've got like a lightweight laptop with an older processor or not a lot of RAM, this could be a bit of an issue for you. If I hit execute and this number goes higher, that tells us that that 6 was limiting the number of max triangles we could put onto our object. And now we've gone from 4 to 13. That's much higher. That indeed was limiting our triangle count. So more is not necessarily always better. It just depends on what it looks like. Now, we have flat areas in the bottom of our holes. That doesn't look good. In a sponge, these holes may go much further, but we're kind of faking it here. And the reason we're getting these flat holes, if we preview our spots with C, you can see the fall off, meaning the transition between the white and the black, is not very big. If we take our fall off and increase it right here, we'll see that it creates a gradual gradient to the middle of the hole. So let's take the fall off and do something like 0.95, so really high. And visually that may not look better yet, but if we go ahead and refresh once again, that's Alt-G. So what we should see is these flat areas at the bottom of our holes are no longer flat. It kind of gradiates, I don't know if that's a word. It's a softer transition and it looks more like a real sponge. I'm liking the way that looks, but the other downside to doing this is it creates much smaller looking holes. So for our spots, I'm gonna increase this from 5 to either 6 or 7. Let's try, I think 7's gonna be too high. Let's try 6. And again, Alt-G to refresh. It's okay. I think I wanna go even bigger yet, so I will go all the way up to 7. Oh, you know what? I forgot to mention radius. So we don't need to increase the scale of the entire texture. We can just increase the radius of the holes themselves. So I can go from 0.25 to say 0.4 maybe. And then also if we wanted a little bit more of them, we could try another level like 4. Might get a little bit intense here, but you get the point. This is when you start seeing a repeatable pattern or anything weird like that that you don't want, that may be a sign that your distortion's too high. I think overall this is pretty good. If I compare this to the sponge, we're seeing a decent amount, maybe a little bit more than I need. I could probably bring this levels down from 4 to 3 again, and the density maybe to 4.5. I'm not gonna spend too much time dialing this in because honestly, that's what takes the longest and I'm not doing anything new at this point. So if you're following along, this is where you can pause the tutorial and spend 10 minutes dialing this in. I don't wanna share that and make this tutorial longer than it has to be. So what do we do to get the rest of the detail in here? Because this is looking pretty good. Maybe one more thing I'll do, because it's gonna make a big difference, is change the displacement height to 1.5. I wanna push these holes in just a little bit further, and that'll make them look a little better too. Next, I'm gonna right click, go to Textures and Cellular. This is the other texture I'm gonna use to capture all these smaller details in between these bigger holes. So it already out of the box looks pretty good. I'm just gonna put this in a color for now so we can see what it looks like. And then when we're happy with it, we'll actually use it in the displace area. So I wanna scale this guy down. I'll uncheck sync, make sure it's not driving anything else. Let's go to 3 and see what that looks like. That's still pretty big, huh? 1, all right, 0.75, that's pretty good. If we were to plug this into displace, again, remember, the way we use this, we kind of inverted it, right? So if we preview this, the white value is getting pushed in. So if we wanted to use the cellular in these dark areas where we wanted to push inward, remember we would have to invert these values. So that's something we want to do. So now the white areas would get pressed in. To actually shape this a little bit, it looks a little bit like crushed eggshells now. We can go into these values and start playing with it once again. Levels is going to add another smaller kind of a fractal type version. So I'll add a little, just one more level. Noise is going to make them a little bit less regular shaped, which I think will help us. And then as far as contrast, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can just kind of play with this as needed. The shapes are going to actually adjust the white, the gray, and the black values in here. And I don't 100% know the math behind this or how to explain it, other than you can just play with it. I'm gonna leave it where it's at so we can see what it looks like just right now. And it looks a little bit bigger than I want. So I'm gonna scale this down even further. I'm gonna go to 0.5 millimeter. Now from here, what do you think would happen if we combine this with our displace? This is where things get interesting. We can right click and do a color composite. Here's the thing, we can only use one displace node. So if we plug this in to the background, the way color composite works, it's like blending layers in Photoshop. If I hit C to preview, you'll notice nothing's happening. We don't see the cellular. That's because our blend mode is set to normal and spots is on top of cellular. So in order to see cellular, we need to blend the two, and we could use a screen. And basically what's going on is it's taking the white values of the cellular and it's brightening the black values on the spots. If we were to take this now and get out of here and just hit Alt-G to refresh, we'll see what this does to the sponge. Yeah, a lot. So here's the problem that you might face if you try to combine these. You can still see some of the slightly deeper pockets that the spots created, but the cellular is being pushed, the black values in the cellular are being pushed minus 1.5 millimeters into our mesh, which is not what we want. We just wanted the cellular to just sort of be a little bit on the surface. Let me explain. I'm looking for detail like these smaller pockets, not the really deep ones. So because we can't actually set different distances for each of these two textures, the way we're gonna do this is one of two ways. We can either take our color composite node and we can take the background alpha and we can start to reduce it, or we could take our cellular values, our white and black values, and make them closer to middle gray, and then they will have less of an effect. Remember, black is not being pushed, so if we take this white closer to black, it's not gonna have as strong of an effect. So if I take this white value and I were to bring it closer to black, if I go back here, remember this was white, so by me bringing this closer to black, it's gonna have less of an effect on the result. So if we get out of that preview and we generate our geometry node again, very nice. That was a pretty good guess. So now what you're seeing is we're getting these little pockets that are coming from the cellular, and we're getting much bigger pockets coming from the spots. And this gives it that nice spongy texture. Honestly, I might have just lucked out with those values. I think that looks very good. Of course, you can play with these until you're happy with the results. Now, I'm not seeing a lot of great lighting here. And before I go much further with the material, I want to get some better lighting in our scene, just so we're making good decisions on the material. So I'll hit M to bring up our library, and I'll go into my environment. Now this is where we could either choose a new HDRI or a physical light. I do want a new HDRI, I think this brings in some color, some nice color. This is like a photo studio. But I still just typically like to bring in HDRIs and use them for ambient light. So for example, once I've done that, I don't want to see it. So I'm going to go to settings and do a solid color background. And why don't we make this bluish gray maybe? Now I want a ground plane, so I'll hit Control G. That adds a ground plane. I'll just leave these as they are, but in my environment, I'm going to turn off ground shadows. Is that what I want? I don't know. I'm going to change this ground material actually to diffuse. I just like the results. I get better with it, and by having a physical plane in here, it's going to bounce light onto our sponge a little bit more like a real surface would. So I'll take this and I'll just kind of color pick this light bluish white. And mainly I want to light this with a physical light. So I'll hit Shift 1 on the keyboard and that's going to give us a physical light. Bam. If you're perplexed by this, you should watch my past video on physical lights in KeyShot where I went into all sorts of stuff about physical lights. That's looking pretty good. Here's another trick. We're going to use a geometry view to place this. So what I want to do is set up my camera for my sponge. This is basically where how I'm going to render this. So I'll set up my camera, create a new camera. Then I'll hit O on the keyboard to open the geometry view. Mine is stacked on top of my library. So if I zoom out, we can go and grab our area light, right click, move part, and open the advanced and click on the target and click on the sponge and hit OK. And what that does is it moves our move tool. So now it's over the middle of the sponge. So I can kind of rotate it while keeping it focused on the sponge or our product in this case. And depending on how harsh of a lighting you want, you can adjust the location of the plane. So for me, I want this to be pretty much overhead, directly overhead to cast a pretty sharp and well-defined shadow. I think that's pretty good. Ground plane's blowing out a bit, but I'm not too worried about that right now. And the bigger the light, the softer the shadow is going to be. So if I hit this reset to move my move tool back to the light and I scale it down, it's going to give me a kind of a more well-defined shadow, which I think is cool. It's just going to be a little more stylistic and it's going to help create sharper shadows within the sponge as well as on the ground. Don't worry, we're not done with the sponge material, but we do want to get our lighting set up so everything reads well. So from there, I think I'm done with that. I'll go back to, I think I'll just close my library for now. Now the ground plane is this light color. I'm gonna darken it just a bit more so we're not blowing out too much in the corner here. Cool, lighting is now set up. So is our camera. I think I moved this just a little bit. I'll go ahead and hit save. And I'll set the perspective to something like 85, a little more conservative. 50 just looks too cartoonish, so we don't want that. All right, let's get on to the color of the sponge. So if I double click on it, get back in the material graph, we need to color this. And I'm gonna do that with, I mean, there's a couple ways we can do it, but I think the best way is going to be to use a texture called curvature. I try to typically stay away from curvature because using it to color things is not always the most realistic. It relies on a lot of human intuition, which tends to be wrong, and it slows things down. If we look at our frames per second up here, we're at 30 with this texture. If I take it off, we're at 60. We cut down our performance by 50% when using this texture. So if I preview it with C, we should clean up some of this noise. There's a lot going on in our model, however. Double click curvature, we want to set them all to pretty much the same value. If we look at our sponge here, we've got this dark teal blue color, and I'm actually gonna color pick that, but I have to move it off screen for a second, otherwise won't see KeyShot. So I'll click negative curvature and I'll use my eyedropper, and I'm clicking in the middle of one of those dark spots off screen, and there we go. Now I'm gonna drag this into my temporary palette. And for the zero curvature, I'm gonna choose the same thing. I'll change it to HSV, and I'll do it one more time for the positive. So, okay, everything looks the same. Now what? Well, we want to take zero curvature and make it brighter because most of our sponge is much lighter than that dark color. So what we're gonna do is increase the value and reduce the saturation a bit, just like that. It's looking pretty good. And for positive curvature, we're gonna use almost the same thing, so we can just color pick that once again, but we wanna make it even lighter in color. Almost white in this case. Desaturate it a bit, very good. Now it's looking a little bit weird for sure. Let's get out of the preview with C. Not bad, but a little bit creepy looking. What we wanna do is soften this and have less detail. And the way we're gonna do that is take the First of all, the radius, it says 1 pixel. That's problematic when we go to render this because it's resolution dependent. Let's turn off radiuses in pixels. Now it's really big and it's not having an effect. It's 1,000 millimeters. Bring it down to 1 millimeter and see what happens. So now what we're seeing, this is quite interesting. Our cellular, remember that's less than a millimeter. So all these little divots from our cellular texture are not being affected by the curvature because it's at the 1 millimeter. If I zoom out, this will be easier to see. Do you see how the edge of this is brighter and some of the edges of the big divots are brighter? That's because of that 1 millimeter radius. As I make this radius smaller, we're gonna start to see some of this lighter color toward some of those smaller divots. So for example, if I type in 0.5, now the whole sponge gets brighter and we see some of that brighter value in here. It's a little hard to visualize, but the other thing we wanna do is, let's see, I'm gonna bring that down even smaller, maybe 0.3. And then what I wanna do is take this cutoff and play with it, because if I go down to a very small factor, we're gonna get this sharp edge. Now if I go the opposite direction, it should soften things and it should look a little bit more natural. Now really where a lot of what we have to do here to dial this in is just basically make the colors correct. I wanna go more like a light teal and have less contrast in here. So let's see how we can do that. I can use a color adjust here to make changes to the negative, the 0, and the positive all at once. And I do think that the 0 curvature is a little on the dark side probably. So I'm gonna lighten this a touch, make sure that we're even lighter and less saturated for the positive. And then for the color adjust, if we were to increase our saturation just temporarily, we can take the hue and slide it around. So going right is making it more blue. If we go all the way to the end and come left, we're making it more teal, which is what we wanted. So I'm gonna take that toward the teal and then I'm going to bring it back down to a saturation of 1 and then maybe even desaturate it a bit. So like 0.9, and then we can also take our contrast if we want to, 0.9, and we can lighten that up too. So that helps. Now we are also using a diffuse material. I'm actually gonna change that from diffuse to plastic. Now this is gonna make it shiny, which we don't really want, but it gives us a roughness value. By default, diffuse was at 100% roughness. These little specular highlights in here, these little white bright pixels, that's making this look like it's really shiny, like a porcelain thing. We want to add roughness. I'll type in like 0.3, which will give it a very rough appearance, but make it still a little bit more specular. I think we're looking pretty good there. Of course, some of you may be wondering about subsurface scattering or making it look softer. You could use, instead of this plastic material, a material called scattering medium if you really needed it to look like a soft, almost see-through foam. You could also use a cloudy plastic. Technically, you could use a translucent, you could use a scattering, translucent medium. I tested it with all of them, and to be quite honest, given this spongy appearance here, this doesn't have hardly any, maybe a little subsurface scattering, but it's overkill to try to bake that into this scene. Let's get on to the scrubber part, but basically I wanted to show you, this is how I made the bottom sponge material on the preview I shared on Instagram. This isn't an exact match, of course, but it's close. All these nodes are the exact same nodes I use. It's just a matter of these settings and dialing them in and making it look just right for your preferences. Okay, I'm gonna right click, show all parts, and this is gonna bring back the top scrubber part. If we look back onto our reference, we see a tightly knitted, sort of tangled mess of scrubber plasticky fabric. Why that's important is because it's plastic, which means it's specular. It's got some shiny highlights. It's got this kind of blue look. So yeah, we're gonna do that. Double click on it. And in this case, we're gonna, of course, go to its material graph. We can start by making it kind of a bluish color if you want, just to make things seem a little bit more realistic, I guess. We'll start with that. Now, what we're gonna use is a geometry node called Fuzz, which you might have used. It could be used for hair or grass or really whatever you need. So if I hit Alt-G again, that should work to add fuzz. First off, the radius. So making these big sticks stick out of here. So let's make this 0.1 and refresh. Now they're looking skinny. Great. Definitely too long, so let's go down to 2 millimeters, refresh. Great. Now we want them to kind of be curly and kind of squiggly, we can take the randomness and increase it. If I go to 1, actually let's go halfway first. Let's go to 0.5 so you can see what that looks like. And it starts to bend them. If we zoom in, they have the amount of bends we're getting here is controlled by the segments. The max curves is going to be like our limiter for how many of these fuzz pieces we add. So we're going to bend them more, go to a randomness of 1 and refresh. So what we really need is them to kind of tangle together and lay down more. So what if I try something like 2? That helps, right? Now, one of the challenges here is I do have some thickness to this piece here. In hindsight, it may have worked better if I had a thinner scrubber piece. However, I also, and this is weird, but I may be able to actually scale it in KeyShot to smash those hairs down. If I hit Control D, I should be able to grab this, and if I scale this and smash it kind of flat, all those hairs, right, all the fuzz starts to lay down and get more compressed. So that's kind of like a trick. And if I refresh the geometry node, they stay like that, which is kind of weird. So that might be a little hack we use to flatten them down when we're done. I'm gonna Control Z till we've gotten closer, and then we'll use that trick if we need it. But from here, what I wanna do is actually increase the length variation, and this is gonna give us a lot of difference in how long each of these get. Because we're gonna have some longer, especially on the edges, some longer fuzz sticking out, we do want some of that length variation. Now what about the appearance of that fuzz? We're gonna grab a material and we want it to be plastic, and instead of diffuse on the surface, we're gonna use the plastic. We wanna take this and try changing its color to that very punchy blue. And the other interesting thing is, it's not applying it to the actual fuzz. So we need to take this and plug it into the, where is it, surface? And if we refresh, it should turn blue. There we go. So now we're using this plastic on the surface. Well, what if we don't want to see this bar in here? How do we make that disappear? Well, this is a bit of a trick. If we right click and go to Materials and Emissive, we can just hide this from the camera. Just take this guy and make its intensity 0. Or make it black, doesn't matter. Basically make it invisible to the camera. Now it's hidden. Turn all these off. Now we just have the fuzz on its own, which I know is weird, but I think that's gonna help us. Now we wanna take our fuzz and start to increase the density. It's at 0.2. Let's make it 1, and this is where it's gonna get really crowded. And this is where things may slow down for you depending on your machine. All right, we're looking pretty good, but the strands are pretty big. We need some more detail in here. So we can take the segments, and instead of 4, let's try something like 12 and see how that looks. That should make them a little bit more organic looking, I suppose. So I'm gonna go all the way up to 16 for that. And then I want to increase the density and maybe even take the radius down a bit. Instead of 0.1, I'm gonna try 0.05 and see how that looks. Great, now they're teeny tiny. Now we just need a bunch of them. So we're gonna take our density up to 2 and refresh. We're filling in pretty well there, but they're also pretty long, so we may need to shorten these a bit. Let's go up to a density of, try 2.5 maybe. And I'll take our length down to 1.5 and see how that looks. We're looking pretty good overall. Let's try the trick where I scale this thing. So Control D, and I'm gonna scale this. So let's turn off the rotate. I'm gonna grab the small green box and drag vertically, and we should see this thing start to compress a little bit. So scale on the Y, it says 0.8, let's try 0.5. So we've kind of smashed it down. I think that's looking pretty good. I think for the randomness, what if I try something like 2.5? Also, it's too shiny, too specular. We wanna take that plastic and add some roughness, so double click the plastic, make the roughness like 0.1, and I'll hit Alt-G. Okay, I definitely did something I didn't want to. Let's check my fuzz. What did I do on accident? That 2.5 may not be good. Let's go back to 2. I'm gonna hit Control Z once, and again. Okay, so I'm still gonna go back in that plastic, add a little roughness, as I did. I think I'm gonna have to scale these down as that very last step. I think if you generate the fuzz on an already smashed piece of geometry or scaled, it's just gonna look a little bit weird. I don't think it's really intended to be worked is not supposed to work that way, but I guess it does. So we're looking pretty close. Let me see about that scale on this scrubber material. Yes, they're a little bit long. Let's fix that. So to kind of keep this a little more of a good comparison, I want to kind of zoom out about the same distance as we're seeing on both of them. And color we can fix more toward the teal for the scrubber stuff. I think its overall scale is okay. We just need to trim it down a bit, if that makes sense. So let's take our length down to 1 and see how that looks. It's going to tighten everything up, maybe even just a little shorter. Let's go to 0.8 and take our density up to 2.75. Okay, so here's the thing. I think we're running into our ceiling of max curves. Let's take 10 and go up to 15 and refresh. I think that 10 was preventing more of the density from being added. Curves is at 2 million. I'll bring us up to 20 and try refreshing and see if that goes any higher. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so let's take that just a little higher. We'll take the density up to 3. I think I want to go even maybe just a little shorter, 0.7 and then 3.5 for my density. Again, this is where you can just spend all day messing with all the details till you're happy with it. I'm gonna take the color of the plastic and make it a little more teal. I'm just desaturate it just a hair. How's that looking? Pretty good. It's a little light still. Let's darken it just a bit. There we go, it's looking a little better. Now I'm gonna use my weird trick and I'm gonna scale this down by smashing it. So I'll hit Control D and I will click on the green box that's hard for you to see and take the scale Y down to like 0.9 and that really smashes it down a bit. Let's try 0.8. It's looking pretty good. Now overall, the scrubber material sticking out past the bounds of the sponge. So we can click on the yellow cube once and scale the whole thing down, like 0.95 maybe. Oh, that's way too small. 0.99, how about? Much better. Now it's also sticking into the sponge perhaps. Let's see. So from some angles we can kind of see through it because it's not as dense on the sides. That's not ideal, but I don't really know how to control that. So I'm gonna click on the scale here and try it one more time. Let's try 0.7 and I'll bring the whole thing down. I think I want it to kind of stick into the sponge just a little bit. Maybe scale this guy down just a hair more, 0.999 or 5. There we go. Looking pretty good, if you ask me. That's pretty much it. Of course, you can play with these for a longer time until you really dial things in. From some angles, this isn't looking so hot. We can see through this fuzz a little bit. I'm sure we could bring back the part that we made emissive, and that would help hide all that, but then it doesn't look as porous, I don't think. Let me check. We can try one more time. You could just keep messing with the density. I also think, depending on how dense the triangles are on the surface, that depends on how much of the fuzz you get. So if I did a retessellate and increase the triangle count before doing this, that probably would have yielded better results. Let me get back in the material graph one more time. I will save this and I'll just get a new diffuse. So I'll go, actually I'll just duplicate this. I'll make it not very specular and make it very rough, like 0.3. And we'll just pop this into surface and that'll bring back that part that we hid. And that's gonna make this whole thing look a little bit more solid. We could probably make it a little darker too. I'm going to maybe take this whole thing, scale it up back so it's less smashed. I think it's looking a little too flat maybe. And then I can kind of pull this into the surface of the sponge. Maybe take the whole thing and scale it up just a hair. There we go, I like that. And then one other thing we can do, again, is take this plastic, we can darken this even further, but then make sure that the actual fuzz plastic is a little bit shinier. So instead of 1.5, we could take the IOR up and that's gonna give us these little specular highlights. Just depends on how strong we want that to be. And then this, we don't want to reflect hardly any light. And I think that helps. Cool. And that's basically your sponge. Yes, it's a little bit slow. Yes, it's a little bit noisy. It's far from perfect, but I think when you compare it to our reference image, I think we did a decent job. And to be honest, it's at 22 frames a second. The thing slowing it down the most is the curvature, which if you're clever, you could probably get around and use something different instead of using the curvature. I kind of cheated that for this appearance to kind of fake the subsurface scattering just a little bit. But again, this whole, I warned you up front, this was not going to be a great tutorial. It's just kind of like me showing you some weird workflow stuff. It looks like whenever you refresh the geometry node, it undoes that whole like, oh, I don't know. That's kind of weird. It's still kind of smashed. These look too long and now they look too large. I don't know why. But that's probably what I get for messing with the scale of this original piece here. If I go back to position, what if I just hit reset? So that goes back to looking like that. And then in the material graph, we could probably just play with these to make them a little bit smaller, probably a little too small. Take our length variation down a bit, 1.7. So they're all about the same size now. Overall, I think that's decent. Maybe lighten this up just a little bit. Take this and darken it a bit. There we go. All right, the last thing, if you want, if this is a little noisy for you, it probably will be, we can go to the image tab and we can take the denoise and turn that on a little bit, and that'll smooth things out a bit. Now, obviously 1 is way too high. We could say something like 0.2, maybe. We want a little bit of noise in there. And if we're getting some fireflies, we could take that up. But the problem is if you bring that up too high, watch this. All the little specular highlights on these little hairs goes away. So we don't want to do that in this example here. So overall, I think that's looking pretty good. And lastly, I'm going to click on my ground material and play around just to see if there's anything that stands out to me as nicer. I don't think I want to go dark, but I don't want something too mid-gray because then it's going to, the sponge will blend into it. So I'm looking for something a little lighter, maybe a little higher contrast, just so we can see some of the fuzz on the outsides of the sponge, because that's that nice detail. And I'm not going to be afraid to zoom in nice and close here. I think that's going to help us out quite a bit. I think that's good, maybe a little bit lighter. And I don't mind that this is going to pure white here. I mean, we could play with it if we want, but really the image tab, if we want to go into photographic mode, we can go into like high contrast and then play with this exposure type thing, contrast, but I don't know. I think the linear one's fine. I'm just gonna go back to our basic preset here. I think the last thing I want to do is go to my environment. I'm going to take the brightness from the HDRI down, so we're getting mostly our light just from the plane or the area light that we have in here. That's going to darken our shadows, give us a bit more contrast within our scene. And then if we take our area light, it's at 1000 lumen. We can probably drop that just a bit if we need to. I think overall it's decent. I'm gonna hit O and just play a little bit more with the placement of that light. I feel like it may be just a little bit close. And as a result, I wanna take my fuzz and just lighten that up a little bit too. It's looking a little bit dark, if you ask me. And I can take that plastic and lighten that up in there too, a little bit. All right, I think at that point, I'm ready to render out this image. Hopefully you had fun. There you have it. Now you know how to make a sponge in KeyShot.